Ah, the one and only Alex Ebert. How are you, sir? And Mr. Wynn as well. You doing all right, Alex?
Oh, how's the marriage business?
It is very good. We're on year 10, my friend. Wouldn't trade it for anything.
Actually, I have speaking of marriage, have you ever felt so satisfied with your homesteading and your relationship and your kids and the beatific sort of vision of life and that all all or most, not all, but a large part of your ambition sort of either subsides or graduates to that beatific vision, and you find yourself sort of incapable of frothily investing yourself in your I don't know, in your work.
I absolutely. I think what you described, because I know you brought that up in one of our OG Bros conversations, I think that is a very real thing. And I think about that a lot. And I think about like, we're just like enjoying being around to us is all we need, which one has the danger of meaning you never leave the porch, which can be bad because so there's an advantage to not needing to go somewhere. And yet it also seems like really important out of that place of not needing to do something to also be able to do something. I'd be curious what you think about that. Because I actually was thinking about it, and Mr. Rivera, good to see you. I was actually thinking about it in light of a lot of the stuff you say on status anxiety or like, Cadell on long-term mediation work, how maybe there's something about having that place that allows you to kind of work through something without just following what everyone else is doing because you don't really care and you don't even need to be doing it. So it becomes a kind of superpower. But in a way, it's also a weird superpower because it simultaneously robs you of the motivation to do that thing that you could now avoid status anxiety and engage in long-term mediation to do. I don't know. What do you think of that, Mr. Ebert?
Well, couple of things. I mean, number one, I think that the I've always viewed, and I think most people have had a hunch that a lot of the great projects of humanity are sort of immortality projects, generally funded by a overwhelming neuroses or fear of death, and that that fear of death and the variations on the death drive are what generate our propulsion toward uh, amazing things, amazing projects, and make us sort of really compulsively driven. Um, and without that sort of neurotic flavor, we might not produce the great feats of humanity. I think that when you look at cultures that are really relaxed and have a sort of really extremely relaxed approach to life, you see a lot less neuroses, and as a result, you see a lot less um, technological progression, a lot less care for sort of giant ambitious projects, and I think you can almost, if you stay in that zone for long enough, you can view those who do undertake massive, large-scale, ambitious projects as curious, sort of exotic creatures driven by some alien force, and and you have to wonder at that point if the whole world fell in love with itself, would what would the resulting state of our ambitious projects be? Um, I have to take my own life and my own experience as a guiding light in this, and say that I think that a lot of people would call in sick to work and play hooky a lot more often than not, and recalibrate their approach to their ambitions, and I think take a much more sort of like hobbydom approach to the projects of humanity, and we probably wouldn't be in the multipolar trapping predicament that we are in now, because the sense of competition, I think, would be significantly decreased. So, anyway, it's just something that I'm going through now. I'm extremely satisfied in my life. in ways that have nothing to do with my career or big projects. And I'm feeling a subsidence of my ambition that is alarming at first. And then once you sit with it for a moment and realize how good you feel when you're not ambitious, suddenly you realize that all the sort of Nietzschean overman talk about, needing to stay within the tension, and that you'll never fully be complete, and you have to resist the urge, and any sense of completion is only a momentary illusion. Um, that actually, that's not phenomenologically true. And actually, you can feel a sense of completion for quite a sustained period of time. And just because it goes away for a little bit doesn't mean that it's an illusion. By that, if duration is actually the count of what is illusory, then you can very easily create a world in which the tension is the illusion. Um, and that's the state I'm in now. I mean, the majority of my experience, my phenomenological experience day to day now, is in a condition of completion. And the minority of my experience is in a state of sort of disequilibrium. And so, if duration were the mark of illusion, then the tension would be illusory. But of course, neither is illusory, they're both real. Um, and I think anyone who says, well, yes, but I prefer to be within the disequilibrated state of tension, is lying. And that's okay. I mean, we can lie. When we're neurotic and we are afraid of the equilibrium, or when we're neurotic and we desire the equilibrium so badly that we have to deny it because to have it and lose it would be a greater pain than to not have it at all, then of course we'll say we prefer to stay in the state of disequilibrium, and then we'll make fun of anyone who's not sufficiently ambitious and say that they have some kind of, regressive genetic precondition. But anyway, I'm experiencing myself treating all of my former ambitions as hobbies, and I have to admit that the feeling of it feels more legitimate. I feel more embodied. I feel more grounded, and I feel less ambitious. And I'm having trouble getting things done that I would previously have done. I have several albums in the wings, but I'm just not in any rush to be famous. I'm not in any rush to succeed. I have a level of success here at home that far surpasses anything I could, and frankly, if we're going to be honest about why we are compulsively achieving, in the end, there is underlying that a neurotic compulsion which secretly wants the state of completion or equilibrium anyway. And so when we achieve that in our home or in our personal lives, it becomes much harder to generate the compulsive, aggressive, really, project-oriented behavior. So anyway, I guess that's all I wanted to say about that. I will end it by saying that as much as I've told this to Cadell last, he still insists in his Ezekian sort of way, and most philosophers do, that state of sort of wholeness or oneness, which is represented, by the way, in the dialectic by the state of sublation. The dialectic is not a dialectic without it. And yet, for some reason, we all decide to say that that state is illusory. It's not real. Keep the tension, hold the tension, don't sublate. Well, if you're not going to sublate, you're not actually even involved in the dialectic. So I don't understand why philosophers are so reluctant to stop saying that it's an illusion, to go ahead and embrace and go ahead and admit that that's actually what they fucking want.
Beautiful. And I think actually what you're getting at is a really, really critical topic that actually has massive socioeconomic consequences and gets into stuff like belonging and different things. Well, let me ask you a quick question and I'll pass it to Wynn and Mr. Rivera. Do you think there is a difference between the feeling of sort of the, the completion that you have now that makes you go, what, I'll get to that album, or there's a kind of lack of aspiration, and say a lack of aspiration from a place of laziness or just like, I don't feel like it. Do you think there's a different quality between those two experiences, you could say, on the other side of working hard versus before working hard? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I don't know what laziness is. I don't know what it is.
That's good.
So for me, what I'm talking about is the supplantation of a prior focal on project oriented, I guess what you call career based orientation to ambition. And I've felt that that ambition be supplanted by a new novel ambition for me, which is the project of love itself, the project of life as such, living as such, as the project, the day to day, the washing the dishes, the snuggling, the what movie are we picking tonight? Ooh, how to make this spaghetti really good. How to hang out in the yard really well, like how to perfect the hangout in the yard, how to remember to take my shoes off and feel the ground. All of these things require a certain ambition. They require a certain sense that this is my project. And actually, what I actually wanted all along, vis-a-vis the neurotic compulsion to succeed, was really, in the aggregate, an experience of myself as complete, or myself as having lived up to my potential, right? The sense of potentiality. And that sense of having lived up to my potential suddenly has a sort of a one-to-one reflexive shortcut to the sort of resonant oneness, which can be found in my daily living, Stan's project. And all of a sudden, instead of viewing my life as this sort of sidecar to the real experience of me, which is my work, all of a sudden my work is now the sidecar to the real experience of living, which is my life itself. And so it's more a supplantation of the drive and the ambition, as opposed to a subsidence of ambition.
I think that's a good description. I would be curious. I feel, though, that is a state that you almost have to go through the process of working hard and come out almost on the other side, or the total saturation point that then brings you to the place of being able to actually be present in those different works. What do you think of that? Do you think you kind of almost have to go through the work to get there?
I don't know. I think I'm thinking about characters in my life that seem to have arrived where I'm arriving far earlier. And I think two things allow one to arrive there. One is a predisposition to wisdom, I would say. I remember a kid in my freshman year of college. I only went to 1 year, so that's the class I got to experience. And he said, we were like the cool guys, and we were selling all these drugs, and we were kind of mean and making fun of people, but like we were nice also, and we were just like these wannabe thugs at college, right? And I remember Dennis McGonigal said to me in his Bostonian accent, all of a sudden, we didn't see as much of him, and he just said, you know what I realized? I just like nice people. And I was like, what? And I remember my dad told me once upon a time that his father, who was a very well-known opera director and founded Glyndebourne and was very, very work-oriented, and they were all sitting around and they were thinking about, well, what if I work with this conductor? And his wife said, well, is he nice? And everyone at the table, my dad remembered, laughed at her. Because what does that matter? Right? But she knew that it mattered, but they didn't yet know.
Right.
I didn't yet know, when Dennis said that nice people, that simply a feeling of being around someone who's nice was something worthwhile. To me, it was more important, their artistic sensitivity and perception and so on. So I think that you can have this epiphany way earlier, independent of any sort of relation. And then I think there's people who I can think back to in elementary school who were already attuned this way, that I sort of look down on as sort of having no passion. And I think people like myself and general paradigm of success can give them complexes, where suddenly their predisposition toward life as such being worthwhile pursuit to perfect the relaxed moment, etc., can develop a compulsion where their big pathology is not having a pathological compulsion to succeed. And suddenly we pathologize them, and thereby they sort of gain this weird thing. The other thing is, and this is, I sort of have to admit that I think I've only gained this perspective because of a sudden resonance with a very particular and peculiar relationship with my fiance. This is the first relationship where I really attribute everything I'm saying to the resonance that occurs between us. I'm very suddenly in her presence and vis-a-vis this relationship awakened to the rest of my life as a hobby and my life as such as the real project. And I'm really grateful to her for that. So I think in a certain sense, that speaks even more to this precarious philosophical assertion I'm making, which is essentially a sense of completion. You have two becoming a one. And of course, we like to say that that's impossible. Now, it is highly unlikely. In my experience, I've had a lot of partners, and this has never occurred with any of them. So I should say something like, yes, yeah, that's a fantasy. But now, having cycled through enough and hitting the bullseye, all of a sudden, I'm like, okay, this is the real thing, and I am feeling this. And believe me, I was very cautious when I was first experiencing this, because I'm taking the philosophical point of view of, well, this is illusory. And obviously I have a bunch of neurons firing off telling me this is a state of oneness and completion, but in fact it's not. It's an illusion. It's just the new relationship energy, and I am kidding myself. But then months and months and months go by, and suddenly you're like, wait a minute, this is terra firma. Okay, I'm going to have to just like suspend my disbelief and say, what I'm experiencing now is the thing that I've always said doesn't exist, and yet I'm experiencing it as existing, and it's creating a very, like, I've woken up to sort of a much more naturalized paradigm wherein my work, right, like being a famed whatever, it doesn't matter, musician, this and that, and at the end of the day, we're looking for this. If we're sharing a project, what it's about is like followers and recognition and money or success and all these things which are obviously superficial suddenly now feel superficial, and they're in their proper place, and so on and so forth. Anyway,
you're saying so much that is very, very important. I'll pass it to Wynn and Mr. Rivera. A few things that come to mind, and I'll just speak from my own personal experience. Rather this is right or wrong or universalizable, I don't know. What I have found is, growing up, I was constantly kind of told or taught, whether it be my grandfather sitting on the porch or Mr. Dillard and Big T or my father, or et cetera, so forth, that money, fame, et cetera, so forth, all these things really don't matter. And what ultimately matters is like your relationships, your community, your family, and so on and so forth. Salt of the earth kind of advice, one could say. And it's very interesting because that has proven true. What was interesting to me is that a lot of the people tend to have more of that kind of way of thinking, that more of a kind of salt of the earth kind of way of things. What I'm curious about is, because though they were not willing so much to say, go out, see the other world, to encounter difference, pluralism, to read books, many of them were much more prone to be manipulated. Many of them were more prone to be swept up in a strongman or a political person, or to get taken down a conspiratorial rabbit hole. And then down that rabbit hole, like the last 10 years, really, more likely to then actually break up the relationships that brought them that total saturation, to then end up and they lost the kind of being that kind of state of completeness that you're talking about. But then there was a problem with people that would leave. I talk all the time about the common life. So they would leave. They were more comfortable with encountering diversity. They were, as a Christian, okay with the atheist or the Muslim, and they didn't have to tell everyone to be like them, et cetera, so forth. But then they were more prone to actually lose the capacity to regain that being, that kind of completeness that they had. I will speak to in my own life, what I find, you know, because just my own personal experience, because I feel that with Michelle and a lot of what belonging about, and actually this is the topic of beauty a lot, because in beauty, like Jockin is teaching on and that we talk about, I would associate what you're describing in your relationship as a kind of glimmer of the beautiful, as would be getting back to the Plato and the Socrates, which is a kind of gathering. And that sort of being, that completeness is a result of a certain gathering of things together in a kind of harmony that actually makes you able to see the garden or the spaghetti. And the secret to good spaghetti is brown sugar, as my grandmother taught me. Just say it's brown sugar, actually. To see that kind of fullness, what I find the tension is not so much then on, once you have that beautiful experience, the tension that I find is still present is not so much in the relationship or the beauty, but in figuring out how to keep it from, say, the tensions of bills, from money, from other people that think you're wasting your life, or people that come in and judge you and you get angry at. Like, that's where, for me, it moves to a kind of self-defense posture. Like, now that you have that beauty, you've got to keep it. And it's not merely against other people who are sweeping in. My mom would talk about little foxes that come to take your joy. And I always like that language, these little foxes. That's what you got to keep the foxes away. But also your own mind, because you were describing it on this feeling of, have I lost my ambition? Like, am I doing something wrong? My mom would say that's actually one of the thoughts you have to get away. Like, you have to fight that thought that would make you feel like you're doing something wrong, and just wait, like you'll talk about, for the encounter of the day. The way I think about it is when the next thing you're supposed to do arises. Now, of course, if you told people you're going to do something, like you said, I'm going to, I work at a wedding venue, I'm going to be there, I've given them my word, right? But when it comes to that project or that work that sets you aflame, I find that notion of encounter is so useful, or you just find yourself there. But until that point, your main work is actually maintaining this kind of beauty that you have, this kind of completeness that you have, which actually is a work, because the foxes are coming, the judgments are coming, the people that are like, you're not like you used to be, Alex, you used to be so ambitious, and that could tempt you to throw it all away. But because you have self-knowledge, training, philosophy, whatever, you're able to self-defense it, defend your garden in a way, and then wait for the day when, like Jockin and I were talking about, that beauty comes forth that then you can kind of call. And I do wonder as well, and then I'll give it to Wynn and Javier here, because I think it's a really important topic, because what you're describing, I actually think is getting at the new paradigm of motivation necessary for economics in 2024. Because you said something very important, which is that had we not had ambition, it's hard to imagine capitalism giving us technology. There were plenty of societies that didn't have the Protestant work ethic, as they call it, or kind of Weber and all of them, that then didn't create industry and all these different things. So you say, well, that seems like then ambition is good, but then there's a point where ambition seems to overfit. Well, then how do you find the sublation? What does it mean then to be rightly motivated today in a manner that is not giving up the state that is more aligned with a kind of satisfaction or a sort of completeness, but is able to defend it and yet still able to do things? This is where the dynamic, the experience of beauty, I find really fascinating. And I think it's really important. And if we don't think this, then basically, actually, to your point, Alex, basically right now, the only way we keep the economy going is by intentionally training people not to be satisfied. Because we have to keep stimulating demand, right? We need people to keep, if everyone's not working, the economy collapses. So literally there is an incentive in the socioeconomic order to incubate the kind of subjectivity that can constantly be stimulated into consuming. And that would be where Keynes talks about stimulating demand. Like, the economy has to keep stimulating demand. If demand is lost, supply goes away. Well, if that leads to all sort of pathologies that lots of different people talk about, like multipolar traps, Smackenberg, like you were talking about, and different things, that's an issue. That would mean you would need an economic system that, as we'll talk about in Belonging again too, creates demand versus stimulates demand, which has to be from a place of satisfaction, because otherwise it's going to be a consumerism that's problematic. But this is actually an insanely difficult problem that, if not addressed, cannot bring about a new, dare I say, new form of motivation that is economically sustainable, and is able to create a society that is not driven by constant stimulation. So this kind of question of the sort of what is the proper way to be motivated or to act that is defending this this completion that I have, but is also not, like I've seen other people, then defended by actually keeping out diversity or pluralism or avoiding people that would question it. And I think that's a very difficult tension that has to be thought. And I do think it is quite central. And let me pass it on to Mr. Wynn and Mr. Rivera. And I think it also might have something to do with the noble comments that Mr. Rivera has been speaking about. But Mr. Wynn, how are you today, sir? I hope you're doing well.
I'm very good tonight. I'm very good. Pleased to be here. I think it's like the 4th week in a row, so I'm very happy I'm making it. I'm achieving it, actually. I'm achieving being here. So this is the question. How do I achieve to be here tonight? Of course, I live in a world and I have the practicalities of the day-to-day world around me. But I find myself, now that I'm so engaged in this community, the question of the beauty, of the good, etc., I find myself, and this came up before, compelled to be here in a way. And I think this is a really nice way to start, because it's good to hear from Alex, and it's kind of, in a way, it's like disjointing the last 3 weeks on the question of beauty. But like you said, Daniel, it's brought it back into the scene, onto the scene, basically. And I think my main point for Alex, and then to spread this through everything I've tried to work through in the last few weeks, and it relates to my work on achieving nothingness. I think the only way to achieve this feeling of completeness is to realize that the very framework which tries to understand the problem of completeness or the problem of incompleteness is itself ready to be seen as a form. Like the very dichotomy between completeness and incompleteness is itself also, in a way, because again, like this comes through with what I'm doing now with the first half of my PhD research. It's looking to the end point of 3 contemporary thinkers, one of which is Zizek. And it's saying that actually the way that they deal with all of the problems concerning absolute knowledge is to find a kind of indeterminate moment, a clearing within thinking, a gap, an inconsistency. And their post-ontology, which is still ontological, exists in that gap. Like, what is it in this clearing away of beings, of things? What happens in this annihilation, this undoing, this skepticism, when you recognize things are illusory? What happens in that place? And as we know, like Zizek re-ontologizes the real as that which is always impossible. And so when you recognize the impossibility of what we did call real, you encounter the real as the indeterminate moment of determinacy that just creeps in as a non-all aspect. My work, in a way, is threading Zizek through to this point by saying Zizek's ontology of the real is a deduction in that clearing. Like, he arrives in this moment of indeterminacy and he re-ontologizes, because he says, haha, like, we've discovered it, the it of no it, the less than nothing, the O thing. Vattimo talks about the historicity of language and says in a kind of historicist way, in a way, that being is that which just sends history. Like, we can do nothing apart from reinterpret what comes to us in this clearing. Like, there is no truth, but I can kind of wait. So Vattimo talks about death and silence. I can wait in that experience of death and silence, what Alex said at the beginning, and see what happens. Very Heideggerian, early Heideggerian. Zepancic follows Zizek's in different ways, but she reads it, and there's a nice book, Nietzsche's Philosophy of the Two, The Short, The Shadow. She comes to Zizek's conclusion, like Alain Badiou's conclusion, which is about the gap. And I have a problem with this. Like, my first half positions this first thing, and I think in the same way that Alex does. And I think this has come up in conversations with Cadell, like from the beginning, since I first started talking to him. I think, and this came up a lot in Heidegger's Hegel. I said, like, Heidegger's reading of Hegel is affirmative of Hegel, because he sees that Hegel's not affirming the inconsistency or lack or the cracked or the divided nature of the one or being, or, you know, he's actually saying that you approach this clearing, and Hegel's just bringing you to that kind of open space within which there is still kind of like a logic, but it's a logic of the nearest things, of the fact that things come and go. The art reveals itself in a way. And then basically the second half of my work is to say that what Heidegger's doing is asking the question of being, which basically means, in Alex's terms, when you have this experience of completeness or oneness, so Heidegger talks about the oneness of the fourfold in the second half of his life, He's talking about that experience where things are gathered to you and you are gathered to things without the necessity to achieve anything. Like if you look at this present moment, which in the history of philosophy we call being, presence as being, Heidegger says being is not what is present for you. Being is that which gives you those beings that come forth of themselves to you without achieving anything. Like everything that all of us are experiencing right here, right now, my words that I'm experiencing are gathered to me. And when I wait in this, I realize that even and this is maybe our difference, Daniel, like the only difference, even my desire to achieve the knowing that I don't need to know, or the knowing that I've already belong in some sense, I really do think, and this is the grace, this is the kind of end part of my PhD, is to talk about when you determine that being is that which gives you what is given. What's given can be contingently different in every instant, like the particularity of each of us where we are right now, like Javier sitting outside contemplating, like each of us in our particular moments, we are there. And the content of our experience is relative in that kind of sense, like it's relative to our own experience, like the relationship Alex is talking about, like that's particular. The Heidegger seeking truth in saying that what is true about those particular moments, even if it's concealed from us or not, is the released quality of that. And of course, he talks about technological thinking, that it conceals the released quality of objects, because they're not for him, they're not objects, they're beings. But technology makes them into objects to the extent that they become objectless. They're used as standing reserves for production and use. But Heidegger talks about when you not even, this is the point, and this is what the last few weeks have been like, you don't even need to let things be. Like they are being let be already in that sense. And I think this achievement of the awareness of being, and this is where it gets philosophical at that point, like to the question of being, is that being is that which lets you be. Being is that which gathers you. And I think, to just try and connect it to what you said, Daniel, like being is that which lets us demand things from the world around us. Like in the sense that, okay, this is the really interesting question that still is quite uncertain for me. Like, can this notion of the fact that things are let be already provoke us to build kind of societies that can use technology in a really engaged way, where we have exchange, we have conversations, we have inquiry, we have technique, we have arts, we have sciences, like can this awareness, which is called meditative thinking for Heidegger, can we arrive at a place whereby we experience those other sides of life which are technological, like the goods in the conversation of beauty and the good? What happens to the goods in this experience of beauty? And I think that was the one point I liked, following what Jockin was saying and everything. Perhaps this kind of imperative of letting things be because they are let be already, all that means at that point is to then realize that, well, the good that we can use pragmatically, Javier, is the knowing of releasing, even if you don't think that being is that which releases already. Like, if you have the subjective comportment of saying, like, okay, in this moment with my relationship, I'm going to let that be. You don't need to say that being is that which lets you that moment be, but you can say, like, in that kind of subjective stance, things happen differently on the personal level, on the self-relating level, on the communal level, And I think this is all I wanted to say, but I think what's come up now is to emphasize the fact. I did write something. I might read it if that's okay, because it comes to what Alex, I think, what was said about potential. Like your question, Daniel, to Alex, like, do we need to kind of work through this idea of potential? Like, if I'm already completed, how do I achieve that knowing? Like, do we have to be predisposed to it? Are there certain characteristics which are doing? So I said, even if you do not live up to your potential, there is the grace of always already being completed, insofar as what was deemed to be completed, and this is the desire of Western metaphysics, is to complete things, to know things, to achieve things. So insofar as what was deemed to be completed or achieved is itself not necessary. But the being of our being is already released. There is no necessity to achieve anything, no predisposition apart from the predisposition to be dispositioned, thrown out of joint. Maybe from what I've heard, Alex, like the saturation point, to be put out of joint insofar as being is that which gives over whatever comes to be. In this sense, the only way to reach potential is to achieve the knowing that there is nothing to achieve. This relaxes the tension to remain in what's called the tension. Sorry, my laptop's being to remain in the tension of that which remains. And this is what's interesting. Tension of coexisting with those forms of knowledge which think that there is something to achieve. Society, the other with the O, that is desiring me to desire, you know? Like, how do we coexist with that if I do take this stance, which I do, of achieving nothingness? And in some sense, this is what this conversation is. This is what my whole project is, as a hobby in some sense, is to recognize that, well, maybe we can teach that we don't need to achieve anything, and that might change the very form. It will transform the form of our coexistence in that particular moment, in the particular historical instant, you know? Yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Outstanding. And I very much appreciate this conversation because, in my opinion, the question of motivation, what motivates human beings, is kind of at the very foundation of the social order. And one of the reasons why economics kind of is so powerful, because when you go back to the Scottish Enlightenment, is because you can almost see it as when philosophy went in the direction of how do you motivate people? What motivates people? Rather it be the theory of moral sentiments, Hume, Smith, those people combined, because the question of human motivation is huge. And I don't think you can basically even begin thinking different forms of politics, economics, society, belonging again, et cetera, so forth, unless you ask questions of what motivates people. Basically, we have gone through history. The best way we dealt with this problem was basically the capital value form, without getting into all of that, stimulating demand, et cetera, so forth. This gave us the technological age. Now, if we're not going to take the position to say that was all one giant mistake, which I don't, because I don't think that's useful, and also I'm a bit Hegelian on the now, then the question becomes, if we are now somehow encountering the limits of that value form, of that form of human motivation, what would be the sublation that includes the old, but in a new way? This, and Mr. Jockin, I'm glad you're here, and because this is where the topic of beauty is so interesting. Because, like, so for example, and then I'll give it to Mr. Rivera, because I think this is very important. What is the difference between, say, aspiration and attraction? Like, if you have, like, ambition is the term, Mr. Ebert. So you have ambition to, so what's the difference between having ambition to write belonging again to versus being attracted to write belonging again to? What's the difference? Does attraction maintain the completed state without it then being more neurotic and being acknowledged, whereas ambition destroys the letting, if you will, right? The kind of being, right? What's very interesting, like Jockin and I were speaking on, it's almost like, because this is, what's very difficult about this topic is, this is where these very fine differences in language seem to make a really big difference. So there's a way in which the only way you experience beauty, which can be anything, like the grass, the spaghetti, the garden, is actually having enough virtue or enough wisdom or experience to actually have the capacity to see that in things, to value things as such, which then might be a value commons, as Mr. Rivera, the ability of forming commons and communities of people who can do that. Well, and that would be the capacity to be aligned with beauty, which then there is a motivation in that, because then you're motivated to what? Do the best spaghetti, to figure out spaghetti, to actually do the garden, right? So but it's more from a place of attraction seems to be a better word, and I'll give it to you, Mr. Wynn. It seems to be a better word than ambition, and yet practically there's a kind of doing in both of those, right? And so then, but Mr. Wynn, please, I saw you raise your finger.
Yeah, just I think maybe a helpful word, like we spoke about the importance of like particular words having certain meaning, etc. Heidegger uses the word like preservation a lot, and I think he is concerned with this idea of like how do we preserve in certain texts he calls it like the oneness, like oneness of the fourfold, meaning like the earth, the sky, what he calls the divinities, mortality, which for him in this period is like the way in which things are gathered to us. Like, you know, everything that we encounter, like a glass of wine, brings with it the world it's from and my particular relationship to that world. like including the sky, like liquid, earth, divinities in the sense that this moment can be spiritualized in some sense, and mortality in the sense that I know also that in this particular moment, that thing will not be there at some point, you know. I think so. Heidegger's question is, how do you preserve that preservation? And he says, in a way, the only way to preserve this is to realize that this moment or this experience, because moment for him is a bit too temporal, like is in the now in some sense, like because even your experience of the past, present, future can be gathered to you. What gathers to you is being, like, then that is the radicality of preservation, is that you don't need to preserve. Whereas we are, like you would say, Daniel, like we're grabbing and holding as if trying to attain the preservation in some sense. Like when you spoke about the bird that lands on the hand, the way to let that be is to let the bird gather itself to you if and when, in some sense. But then if you need to build a house because you know where you've moved to in the world, that the climate doesn't suit not having a house, you can build a house, you know, because you know that lets you dwell. And then that lets, in a way, you preserve your experience of what's gathering. And I think this is the point, like releasement always connects to this preservation in Heidegger's reading in some sense. And I think just this word preservation might be useful for me personally. And
well, I find the word, and I'll give it to preservation goes with the self-defense I'll talk about with Hume, because when I think about it, like if you're able to find that kind of satisfaction in the garden, I'll just use the garden example, kind of talking to what Mr. Ebert was saying. If you're able to find that satisfaction, what I would say is that then you have to preserve it, which that is where the philosophical training, when people come in with their little foxes and worries or concerns, or you yourself have a voice in your head that is telling you you're a failure, your ability to fight that off, I find is strongly connected to your capacity. That, me personally, I think there is some connection between that self-defense and maintaining preservation that is tied to, say, philosophical training. As long as by that, we don't mean just simply the memorization of the history of philosophy. Because there's something about philosophy in this way that helps you think through what really matters, develop empathy, think about yourself, your own thought process, that then comes in service of this preservation. And this preservation then lets being be, but there's a kind of work in a way, it seems to me, that is required to get to the place where you can keep that preservation. And then in doing that preservation, things come forth to you in a way that attracts you to them versus you being motivated more so by a certain aspiration or anxiety or something external. If this is also, and there's more to say because this question, because I think this is very important, but I'll give it to Rivera. If this is also, there is something then about a new theory of motivation for economics that has something to do with an infrastructure that trains people to more so be able to preserve and let be and defend that preservation in order to have a sublation of capital according to a different value form. You could say a kind of value form of beauty, attraction, and so on and so forth, versus the current structure that requires extrinsic demand, which then I think is indeed falling into an economy that is based on keeping assets high, like housing, Piketty, the great stagnation of Cohen's. Like we are seeing the limitations of the current theory of motivation that is actually not able to preserve and find attraction from that preservation that you were describing. I think it is a very significant issue. And then that leads to all sorts of pathologies that then blow up on a global stage. But let me pass it to Mr. Rivera. Mr. Rivera, it is good to see you today, sir.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have too much time to talk about noble comments. But yeah, I mean, I agree with Ebert. Though I might disagree on how he reads the Overman. It's because like yeah, I mean the Overman is about tension, but I think it's like the more that Wynne put it. Because, and I'll read, I have the Will to Power with me right now, and I know there's problems with the Will to Power, fundamentally how it's gathered, but there is definitely some passages I could point to, even in like Twilight of the Idols and all that stuff. But I'll just read this part here. Nietzsche talks here about the strong will and the weak will, and he basically is saying like it's like a metaphor. You know, it's a metaphor. But this is where I also know that I think Heidegger was like a really good reader of Nietzsche. And this is exactly what Nietzsche says here. He goes, and this is part of his notes. He goes, on the hygiene of the weak, everything done in weakness fails. Moral, do nothing. Only there is the hitch that precisely the strength to suspend activity, not to react, is sickest of all under the influence of weakness. One never reacts more quickly and blindly than when one should not react at all. A strong nature manifests itself by waiting, postponing any reaction. So, and then actually I like this other line. He goes, the will is weak, and the prescription to avoid stupidities would be to have a strong will and do nothing. That's very in counter to ambition, isn't it? But I think the word, instead of tension, I would use is that Nietzsche, at least in the translations, they're fixated on reactions, reactionary, what reactive forces versus active forces. And what's funny about this is that the most self-preservatory forces are active versus reactive forces. And I was thinking more about what Wynne was saying, and I was like, well, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because it seems it takes much more strength to remain, to abide, to dwell, than to react. And this is something that is really haunting to me because it sounds so counterintuitive. And yes, we say the word do nothing, but really, how much strength and force does that take? And I think this is how I understand Nietzsche in that sense. And I do think what a noble common would if there was a noble common to exist, I think a noble common would attempt to understand this, that there is a sort of a demand of force to remain. And you know, even this idea of preservation, I mean, how much strength does that take? And all I see actually in a lot of the world today, and it's really tempting, actually, it's very tempting to not remain. It's very tempting. Everything in the world tells you that it's not okay to simply be. And what I find also interesting about Nietzsche's notes on decadence is like he's saying that decadence, like we can't stop it anyways. It's like it almost has to reach its end. Nihilism is the logical conclusion. So long as man still believes he has value, unquestionable value, then we're still in that period of like still going through nihilism in some ways, because it's only when we start understanding that perhaps what we thought man was is value. And I think technology is doing that, but I think technology hasn't reached its point where we say, oh, the being is just like human being is just nothing. Like we haven't done that yet, because we keep saying, well, the human being could be something as long as we pair it up with technology. So it gets really interesting, and then I start to question whether Nietzsche's nihilism is perhaps longer than than what needs to be longer. I don't know, or he's just completely fucking wrong. But yes, I mean, I do think that there is this kind of going through. I mean, the idea of completeness is interesting because Nietzsche's critique is like, why completeness? That doesn't make any sense. Like, why do you value it? Why is it inherently obvious that you value completeness? And why shouldn't we value incompleteness? Like, it's a very interesting, like, all you can do is circle on the fact that you value completeness. That's all you're saying. You're not really explaining why you do value completeness. And it's the same critique that Ebert's doing with non-dynamic versus dynamic. I mean, actually, I think it's the most Nietzschean take. It's like, why do you value dynamic states over non-dynamic states? Like, it's just like, but I think like that's Nietzsche's whole point. Like, we're valuing things as givens without really understanding what value is. But I think the overman, or to even I mean, screw the overman idea. I like the noble commons idea. Is to understand that we create the values, and when we create the values, the world ironically has more depth. But it seems like as if we have to go through that period of nihilism, that there's meaninglessness, so on, to really understand the real depth to it. And I think it's like the playing with like the negative pragmatism, like playing with the space of ignorance. Like space of ignorance allows human depth, like you said, Ebert, and I've always appreciated that. It's like, well, that's what's so amazing about it. We can create values, and we do create values. Like that creates human depth. But there's a way to create human values, I would say, that perhaps could create more human depth. And it would be already from the notion that we shouldn't be functioning off of given values. But it would be interesting to realize that the given values are just created values. And then, something like ambition is just like, well, I don't even, like what you said, Ebert, it's like, I don't even know what laziness is, because a given opposing contrary value that society has given, that doesn't make any sense. Like laziness is just like, oh, a man that doesn't do work. It's like, is that inherently bad? How is that inherently bad? Like it doesn't make any sense until we really get into the root of the critique of values. But yeah, this doing nothing, this self-preserving, I mean, it does take a lot of strength. And I do think going in that area, social apparatus, doesn't matter how small, I think would be kind of like a noble common. It would be that exertion of force. I know there's more that I want to say. I think I'll leave it there.
No, it's magnificent. I'll give it Mr. Ebert. Well, so there's a few things. The question of value creation, one of the reasons why I've become very interested in like Michelle, Bowens talks about value forms, called Planier, Karatani, because there's been this notion in capitalism that the value form of exchange and capital is naturally occurring. It's not created. It's actually just what human beings rationally do when they interact. Well, that's a kind of, I don't know if I want to say empirical claim, but it's at least a studyable claim. And when you go back on history, what you see is actually the value form. And what I mean by that is the formulating principle of a notion of value that the society organizes around, okay, like the value form. Generally, right now, the value form is capital, meaning that we organize behavior based on prices, economic activity, utility. Obviously not in every single instant, but the majority of exchange would be the language of Marx, is in terms of the capital value form. Doesn't have to be, but it tends to be in Western society as we know it. And people like von Mises, Hayek, many of the Austrians, Bolzabos, I can't ever say his name, in like the 1870s, they want to argue, in order to give that value form a kind of objective authority, they want to say that it is naturally arising. I think if you look at the history, it's clear that it's not. It was created. Now, this is where you then have to choose. Do you want to say that was a giant mistake, and before the value form of capital, we were all in harmony with nature and everything was great and so on and so forth? Because you hear that. I will leave that for others to decide. I think you can make a very strong case that everything has trade-offs. And regardless, what we see now is basically the necessity of creating or thinking a different value form. And the value form, if we associate with beauty, seems to have something to do with what Ebert is describing on the capacity to see value and say, making the spaghetti. I like that example because my grandmother made really freaking good spaghetti, and I'll pass it on. So here's the difference. So you could say in the past, they didn't make, before capitalism, if you give me a big history, very general way of putting this, before capitalism, people didn't make spaghetti because they didn't have any aspiration. They just ate leaves. Why? Leaves are good enough. We don't need spaghetti. There wasn't the ambition. Well, then ambition came on the scene. It's like, nah, you ought to make things to make money. And because people are like making money, they then invented spaghetti. I know this is not the history of spaghetti, but if you grant it to me. So spaghetti comes into existence because of the possibility of making money. And then everyone's like, great. Oh my gosh, spaghetti's actually wonderful. Why didn't we come up with this before? Well, because we were satisfied with leaves. So we saw no need to create spaghetti, right? What we have now, though, is what if the corporate system doesn't create anything beyond spaghetti, or all of your friends think that only spaghetti is worth making? Do you have the courage to, I think it is a kind of courage to say, well, I don't need anything else, but I'm going to make pineapple sandwiches. Why? Bye, Mr. Rivera. I thank you for being here, sir. Like, I'm going to make pineapple, like, freaking sandwiches because I'm attracted to the vision, the shine of that. And so you make your pineapple sandwich, and people are like, well, no one's going to buy it. No one is going to eat it. It's just going to be yours. And yet, nevertheless, you're able to say, I value it. And in fact, you're able to preserve the clearing in which you make the pineapple sandwich. And anyone who tells you that's a waste of time or stupid, you're able to defend yourself from it without being isolationist, because that's what a lot of people are doing now. They're saying, well, we'll just be a Benedict option. We'll be isolationist. We'll cut off from the rest of the world. If they're not going to like our pineapple sandwich, then screw them. We'll just be with other people who like it, right? But this is the isolationist direction. In order to have a value form that basically sublates the economic system of motivation, it would require people to create basically pineapple sandwiches from a place of seeing value or beauty or possibility in it for its own sake, and then not being overwhelmed by the fact that the people around them don't understand it, or they think they're wasting your potential, or you're being stupid because why can't you be satisfied with spaghetti like the net, Mr. Wynn? So this problem, if this issue of the value form, according to beauty and human motivation in general, cannot be addressed, then we really don't have a way to think a new structure of motivation for the economy, ergo all of the problems that everyone talks about with capital, which then makes you think that what we need to do is go back from capital, but that brings its own issues, I think. And then if we think of the overmen, I think if we think of tension and the overmen as needing to preserve that place of preservation, that clearing, we can see how there can be a tension that is found in the work of being, like there's a tension in that you always have to be ready for the encounter. Let me, maybe this is a way to word it, because there's always going to be obstacles, but you don't have to define yourself by tension. There seems to be a difference between being always ready for challenge and tension, and living in a world where tension is always there because there's always something that can challenge you, versus defining yourself by challenge. And in fact, if you're ready for whatever challenges life throws at you, there's a way in which you don't even experience them as tensions. This is what's really weird. Like if you get really, really good at improvisation on the piano, yeah, there's a tension because if you miss a note, it sounds stupid. But if you get good at it, you never miss the note, and you don't and even if you miss the note, you're able to jump on it and incorporate it in. So there's a weird way in which something that's tension actually becomes flow, which then makes it seem like it's not even tension because you're so aligned with it. So it's almost like it's a movement, the negation sublation of tension into this more saturated state has a certain kind of alignment with it. Instead, Mr. Wynn, please.
Just one very quick comment. This goes back to last week's idea of like was it the honorable enemy?
Yeah.
And like to affirm, like tension seems to be a negative in relation to completeness or perfection. And I think like on one side, you have like an ontology of tension, inconsistency, cracks, antagonisms, failure. On the other side, completeness and perfection. But I think you can find perfection in understanding that those moments of tension are in themselves not negative. They are gaps and inconsistencies when you try to achieve completeness. But I think at some point you can affirm both the good and evil of it. And this goes back to what Heidegger was saying, like technology is not bad in and of itself. It's bad if it dominates us. Like if we live a way of living which sees tension as the way of being itself, or the crack as the inconsistency of life itself, I think we failed because we've fallen into that belief system which basically like falls onto one side. But I think in a way, like when you can affirm life in all of its weird moments, you recognize that what we're calling tension is necessary to play the piano in some sense. Because without the possibility of failure, there would be one tone. There would not be variation or difference in some sense.
No, and I not to, and I think there what's being described again to just kind of the language of Jockin is there is a ability to have a certain gathering under beauty, gathering under self-forgetfulness that is like completeness, but it's in a kind of movement that requires a certain working to get to. And this is kind of the question. Can you get the ability to see like a beauty coming forth in spaghetti without a certain working and development to get to that place? And that would kind of be the working of virtue, which means you have to go through something to get to it and to keep it. But then how do you not just keep working forever? Like, you got to enter that kind of releasement. But let me give it to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert, please.
It's been good stuff. I wanted to circle back to the ambition versus attraction issue, because I think that's sort of part of the crux. And then I want to talk a little bit about the failure to stick with phenomenology, which I think accounts for Zizek. And I think that I agree with Thomas here, Wynn. And I think that Zizek's failure there is a failure to stick with phenomenology. But so ambition, I would say, part of sticking with phenomenology is remembering to include interiority and exteriority in our thoughts. And that ambition, in my experience, and I think also when I just sort of think about it in terms of freak theory, ruptures the interiority of this self-relating indeterminacy, objectivizing the self and putting oneself in a place of self-alienation where I am now, the being I am experiencing now, is not it, and is not me. And so there's a sort of downward causation where you envision the next sublation. That's where you exist, right? That's where you're supposed to be. And so that the dialectic that may very well get you to that sublation is simply not enjoyable because you're alienated from the experience of the dialectic. And in a lot of ways, we're talking about a qualitative difference in the experience of one's personal dialectic. I'm not sure, for instance, that one variation like attraction necessarily gets you there faster, or gets you to the correct sublation rather than the incorrect one. But I do know that the dialectic will not be as enjoyable if it is not an attraction and rather an ambition. Because the ambition seems to self-alienate yourself from the dialectical position, count the very dialectic of oppositions which is required for this ablation to be a waste of your time or something that you wish to get over as soon as possible. It's important, the self-relating, Hegel's dialectic language is one of self-repulsion, which gets you out of the sublated state, and then self-attraction, in which, and I'm basically quoting verbatim, attraction wins out. And that when attraction is very important to Hegel, when attraction wins out, that is the moment at which the oppositional oscillations collapse into a unity, when attraction wins out, right? So, and by the way, this is a self-repulsion and self-attraction. And in a lot of ways, this means a lot. When we're attracted to ourselves as such, we tend to instantly, like very rapidly, sublate. When we allow ourselves to be self-attracted, not in a classically neurotic way, but in a sublime way, where we allow ourselves to be, well, what occurs at the point of self-attraction is the state of indeterminacy, which creates interiority. I almost basically define interiority as the phenomenological presencing with indeterminacy, with the saturated state. And that unless you're in that saturated state, you actually don't experience yourself as a subject. You experience yourself as an object. And this brings me to the notion of preservation, because when we're trying to preserve the contours of our interiority, we effectively externalize ourselves and self-alienate, right? And so that the preservation is the preservation of the condition or the shape, the objective shape or conditions of a state, which is to say the determinate position of the self, which is to say not the indeterminate interiority of the self, which constitutes the subjective position, but the objective position of trying to preserve the exteriority, the determinacy of the self. And that is a state we've all experienced, and it's very self-alienating. When I do not feel that I am in the correct state, or when I am not accepting myself as such, I essentially self-alienate, and I feel, of course, that I need to sort of neurotically propel myself into the next collapse or sublated state, which is finally promises me my own interiority, the proper interiority, the proper indeterminacy within which I can dwell as a unity. I think I've said enough about that, except I had a couple of sort of choice phrases here. Preservation places the subject on the exteriority of the indeterminate interiority of the subject, presiding over its own limitations and thereby self-alienating oneself to the place of a determinate identity which cannot or is not inhabited. So we have our identity, but we're not actually even inhabiting it, right? Because we're trying to preserve it. And then I guess I would just and then a quick note that I'm not a Nietzsche scholar, really. I've just read some. I'm just not teenager enough to like really get into him. But is it me, or I don't know if he ever connects the overman to the child, but the child is the final stage of spiritual development, and he seems to create that trilogy almost orthogonal to the notion of the overman. I don't know or never heard anyone connect the two, but if the child is the ultimate sort of spiritual manifestation of development, and the overman is, they would probably be the same person, in which case you have a childlike sort of state of being, which does represent the overman. What's his name? Our boy Javier is gone, but I wanted to say that Nietzsche, I don't know where he quoted that idea that Nietzsche said that the ultimate will is to do nothing, but that's certainly my sense, is that the will is always a negation of automaticity. I'd love to talk more about this sort of like Zizekian, and I think Heidegger, is sort of like really roots himself. I'm not a Heidegger scholar either, but in phenomenology, and is loath to abandon phenomenological considerations. So anytime I do read Heidegger, I tend to agree with him, and very often when I talk to sort of more Marxist Zizekian interpretations, or even Lacan, especially Lacanian interpretations of Hegel, where we have, the split self, the split subject who is always split and never whole, and these sorts of things. That seems to me to be an entirely non-phenomenological reading of Hegel that pretty much misses the point of the dialectic. And at some point, I'm going to actually stand on that rock and defend it and go toe-to-toe, and have to have some pretty serious disagreements with folks like Cadell on that issue.
Divine. You said a lot that was really, really good, Mr. Luber. It's good to see you. So a few things. I think that the conversation between Hegel, Deleuze, and Heidegger has nearly driven me crazy for a bunch of years. So then, I try to go back to the spaghetti to see that sort of, completeness in that, to not fly off into the mad land, because I think really also the stakes of the political economy and the sociological all come to a head there. And basically, by not thinking, as I'm just framing it today, this problem of motivation, we're kind of stuck basically choosing between those three, which then does not actually provide, in my opinion, a sustainable sociological address. Now, the book has to go into that. I do think there are ways to think these together. If we cannot think these together, we're basically stuck with a pathological neoliberalism, Duginism, I could go on, or a loss of social intelligibility that I tried to describe Japan according to. So I think the stakes are very real. Now, also, I really like what you were saying with the attraction. So the attraction ambition thing. So then also to show why I think there are really massive institutional consequences to this issue that is being described. So if I were to just speak very generally, and then I'll give it to Mr. Wynn, if we associate the attraction with this more kind of self-saturated ability to kind of just be attracted to the spaghetti, and now I really want some spaghetti, so I wonder, you know, I'm thinking Olive Garden, but it never is frickin' Meemaw spaghetti. But they do have pretty good breadsticks. I do have to say, if you get that Nookie soup and you mix it all together and you have a gift card because you can't afford it otherwise anyway. And ambition has this kind of self-alienation character to it. So basically what we are discussing is the possibility of motivation from a place of attraction, not needing something, not so much neurotic. The reason why this is very interesting is because if we grant that as actually being a kind of virtuous state, and that there is something about virtue that is earned that then allows you to be motivated by attraction, which you could also associate more with the sithome versus the neurotic, as we were saying with Chetan and all them a few nets ago, then basically it will never be the case that the best people will run for office, that the best people or most virtuous people will be CEOs. And in all terms of probability, it will likely be the case that the people who want to become president or who want to be in government will always be the people with ambition. And this is, I think, why so there are two things I try to compare and think about. It's why I have a lot of sympathy, actually, for when Plato says, we got to force the philosopher kings back into the cave. You're like, well, that's terrible. Yeah. They'll never go back otherwise because they're satisfied. And the rulers will be the neurotic, terrible type. And comparing that with an essay by Friedrich Hayek, where he asks a fascinating question in The Road to Serfdom, although I do think Keynes's critiques of that book are quite powerful. But there's one essay where he asks, just like Lepidco, why do the worst always get to the top? Why is it that the worst kind of people tend to be the ones who run corporations or governments? Not always. No one is saying that. But why is it that there seems to be something about the bigger the system and the more power that's there? And this is why Lepidco is also like, you got to keep things small, because the bigger it is, the bigger the ladder to get to the top, whether it be government or corporation, then the higher the likelihood that the only people that will get to the top will be the people with ambition, which are self-alienated. They are not virtuous or as likely to be virtuous, and are probably looking for a problematic pathological completeness that we're critiquing versus this self-satisfaction that is found in virtue. Oh, frick. That means in order to get people of virtue in those positions, you have to force it, because otherwise they're not going to want to, because they're happy with frickin' spaghetti. We have a massive issue. This would basically mean only two things that Plato actually understood. You force them back into the cave, into positions of power, because otherwise they're just happy with their spaghetti. They don't need to be president. They don't want to be president. Or you somehow make the presidency have a kind of beauty to it, that a value form that would attract them into it versus be ambition. Otherwise, it is a matter of probability that it will always be the worst who mostly get to the top, following Friedrich Hayek, especially the bigger the system becomes, the bigger the institutions. You could deal with this by a non-rational choice where, you know, this is how you would keep it in the realm of freedom, where the people who actually primarily operate from a place of virtue and attraction, from that place simply non-rationally choose to become president or to become the head of a company, even if they don't need to, even if they don't want to, even if they don't care. They nevertheless non-rationally choose. And as we talk about in Belonging Again 2.1, the only way to deal with a Nash equilibrium, all the stuff Smackenberg took game theory, is where you get a suboptimal result if everyone is rational, is with a non-rational choice, something that is non-rational, not irrational, but non-rational. It either has to be the people who operate by attraction and virtue non-rationally choose to go into positions of power for whatever reason, or they are non-rationally forced into those positions, like is described in the Republic. This problem has not been addressed or thought. It is a gaping hole. And basically what it has left us with is either totalitarianism or stimulating people through extrinsic motivation into these positions of power, which then, of course, is on the side of ambition versus attraction. And then, of course, what would follow from this is pathological institutions and systems and so on and so forth. So this issue, and I'll give it to Win here, this issue of motivation and how people from an attraction virtuous state would non-rationally choose position. Oh my gosh, that's how. You put that in the White House and the most virtuous people will be attracted to positions of power. That is the beauty. That might be the greatest outfit I have ever seen on a feline in my 30 years on this planet. Oh my freaking God. What's the name, Alex? What's the name? What is the name? I can't hear you. Unmute. What's the name?
We're still figuring it out.
Platonic form.
We just got him last night. Yeah.
Freaking looks like Yoda. Yoda
should call him
Socrates.
Precious.
What Precious? Oh yeah, the Precious. Put the ring on, you'll be invisible. Every time you pick up the cat, you're invisible. You know, and Sauron, if he sees you, just goes "Aw" and blows up the tower himself because he would never want to destroy a world with something that beautiful in it. So anyway, I'll give it to Mr. Win. This issue of motivation is really central to the problem of pathological institutions, et cetera, so forth. And it speaks to where I think together Plato forcing people back into the cave and what Friedrich Hayek talks about on why the worst get to the top and Lepidko, but let me give it to Mr. Win. Mr. Win.
I spent the last 5 minutes looking for the word feminology on my documents. I missed it, and then I heard something about cat, and I looked, and there's cute cat. I just basically wanted to just make a comment on what Alex was saying, because basically I'm still like I'm revising the middle section of my work, and it's really like concluding about the Zizek point. And the way you said that, Alex, is perfect, because in a way, like Zizek is resorting to ontology, and I think in a way he always kind of remained there, but because his ontology is very like very nuanced. Is like through logic itself, ontological logic, he kind of still arrives at this kind of clearing and indeterminacy. And he constantly plays with it, constantly plays with it, constantly plays with it. But in a way, like the question is, what makes him play with it? Like surely he's had this experience of indeterminacy, but because he is obsessed with writing and talking and quantifying in some sense, I think this is the interesting personal particular question. Like, why does he not allow? And I think this is because he deduces, and maybe it's based on his own particular perspective. And this is why I say in this section, like Vatimo, Zupancic, and Zizek all kind of arrive at this point, but then they never really dare absolutize a quality of this indeterminacy. And I think because Heidegger, I think in a way I've understood it, he's trying to understand what it's like from the other side of the indeterminate moment. But then the question is how? Like, how do you not resort to ontology in this space where you feel like you experience the event of indeterminacy, you wait, you recognize that the way being is unconcealed to you, or just beings around you is of a completely different quality. I think Heidegger's interested in that kind of event because he would say this is where essence is, this is where truth is. The truth of things appear in the indeterminacy. For Heidegger, indeterminacy does not mean the closing down of things. Things find their essence for the being there that experiences that indeterminacy. And basically, they can become whatever they want to be. It's just the experience of whatever they come to be. And that's the quality that he's concerned with. I think these three thinkers that define like the postmodern nihilistic problem, or at least tackle it, they don't dare approach that question of what I say is the character or quality of the experience of death, of silence, of the gap, of inconsistency. Zupancic and Zizek quickly ontologize that moment to say, haha, we've caught it. We've caught being's own inconsistency. And in a way, it's a smart move. I think it's like that is the final consequence of modern Western metaphysics before Kant and after Kant with Hegel. I think in a way, in terms of a logic, in terms of a very modern rational logic, but in my opinion, this came up with Cadell, is like that sort of deduction remains within natural consciousness. I think it's trying to like quantify the experience of the clearing and say, haha, we've got it. We've got absolute knowing, which is the knowing of the impossibility or knowing of the limit of knowing in some sense. But I think this is the question, where does that limit bring you? And can you speak into that indeterminacy? I think Heidegger's work is interesting because I think at the end of Western metaphysics, he calls it thinking. I think he does think about thinking to the extent that he does bring in this different quality of knowing. And he calls it a phenomenology of the inapparent. And what is apparent is presence. He's not concerned with the details of what's present in his phenomenology, like his maestros were in some sense. He's concerned about what lets that presence be presented to you. And I think his answer at the end of his life is really graceful because he says, being is that which as gift is giving beings already. And when I experience that grace or the goodness of that, not only is nihilism kind of bystepped or overstepped because you recognize, the very form of the problem of nihilism, the seeking out of meaning within those use values, it's not like, I can just repress it and hide it. He's saying, no, actually what appears is a determination of being, which in the end he calls the Godhead, which gives. And the way it gives, in my experience of indeterminacy, is really fucking graceful. It's really beautiful because I recognize I don't have to achieve anything. And I think this is where the words like oneness come involved, or completeness, or there's that sense of I'm not just one with indeterminacy, I'm also one with whatever comes to my mind. Like the particular aspects of what comes forth for me, unconcealed, aletheia, is true, despite whatever the content is of what comes forth, And it's like, oh God, that's great. That's good news in that sense. I think so. Basically, with this work with Zizek, I think he kind of he recourses, he panics in a way, and I think all these three thinkers do. But what's great about these three thinkers is without them and their work and their challenge to the question of nihilism or postmodern thinking, we wouldn't really arrive at that clearing through the history of Western metaphysics. And that's why post-Kantian philosophy is really good, because it questions your own particularity to the extent that you arrive at indeterminacy, but not in a kind of the way that we spoke about. But Daniel, you spoke the people who you grew up around, who were very simple, aware of all the things around them. Heidegger talks about the farmers in the Black Forest and stuff. And at one point in his life, he affirms the way of being of these farmers. But then he recognizes, but they also resort to certain ideologies very, very quickly. So there is a kind of labor there in a way. I think maybe the labor is to pass through thinkers who challenge the history of Western metaphysics and bring you to that kind of endpoint of modern, postmodern philosophy, not to a postmodern philosophy, but to what Heidegger would call a phenomenology of the inapparent, which maybe, and this is what I was working with today, maybe this phenomenology of the inapparent brings in a type of ontology, in the sense that I can walk around knowing that being is graceful because it lets things be. And that knowledge is kind of ontological still, because I'm determining being in that sense. But not being in its negativity, nor being in its positivity. It's just saying whatever is let be for me. And it doesn't make me passive. It doesn't mean that I just kind of stand there like this. It makes me engaged, because then I find myself compelled and ambitious for things, And I personally find this myself, especially in relationships. And this was our conversation, OG Rose, about letting be, the cipher, relationships. How do you tidy a room? How do you do art? What is art? How do things come forth of themselves? And I think the grace of letting be, in a way, is a way to phrase that. And it is phenomenology. The only way to get to the inapparency of what's present is to do philosophy, which means to think about what being is. And this is why being is so important, And I think if you're interested, I would say read Heidegger's, it's the 4 seminars, they're notes from the students or friends of Heidegger that were there with him. And he talks about the phenomenology of the inapparent. He approaches Hegel, and he talks about how Hegel arrives at the clearing of actuality, of consciousness as such. And then my work with the Heidegger's Hegel for Goodell's course was to try, and I've already improved this in some sense, try to read releasement into Heidegger's Hegel. So Heidegger criticizes Hegel, saying, yeah, Hegel arrives at indeterminacy. He arrives at the phenomenology of indeterminacy, but he can't think what gives it in some sense. But I would say, well, maybe in Hegel, the absolute is that which gives itself to you in a released quality. Like it gives itself to you in that sense. Yeah, that's my just.
I think one thing that people really miss, actually, I've never spoken to anyone who hasn't missed this, and I don't know if it's because I'm coming at it from like my freak theory thing, but for Hegel and the way that I read him, and I'm totally convinced that this is what he is striving for, is that there is the only things that presence themselves as determinate objects are those things which have undergone reached or surpassed interior quantitative thresholds of dialectical process, which have yielded an indeterminacy of interiority. And that very indeterminacy of interiority entails a determinate exteriority, so that the only things that present themselves as such are saturated objects, and the very saturation of them presents them to the world as determinate. So you can almost think that, I don't know the best example to use. I'd almost like to imagine it as a cloud, but let's just say a balloon. A balloon is not a balloon until you fully blow it up, and then it cuts the image of balloon across the sky because it is fully dialed up. And in a lot of ways, that's, when Jordan, these are all bad examples, but when Jordan's in the zone, right, he's in a place of indeterminate sort of self-loss. Parietal lobe is sort of like missing. He's in the zone, not thinking. Everything is second nature. Nothing's determinate. Everything's sort of indeterminate, and in a state of equilibrium with the environment, where there's very little distance phenomenologically between himself and the ball. Everything's an extension of himself, and so on. That state where he is internally non-dynamical is when he is externally super dynamical. That's when he's suddenly so much different than the rest of his environment from the outside looking in. And for Hegel, everything like the point becomes the dialectic, the point becomes the line, the dialectic, the line becomes the plane, the dialectic, the plane becomes the space. None of these things, the line, the point, the grid, the space. What am I missing? Anyway, none of the plane, none of these things become themselves or present themselves until the dialectical quantitative threshold of saturation and collapse into unity occurs. And it is only at that place in which it occurs that the indeterminacy of the dialectic, right? So it collapsed into a unity, a self-same unity, that means indeterminate. So the plane, in order for it to present itself to us as a determinate object or feature of the world, must be in and of itself and in its dialectical process indeterminate, and have arrived at an indeterminacy which is characterized by a unitary trait, by a unity, by a oneness, which is itself indeterminate. And then we can make all this make sense, I think, when we think about, again, maintaining phenomenological status, the way that we process information. This thing appears to me to be a determinate object precisely because I no longer question what it is. I was having a conversation with Daniel the other day. Daniel is the most Daniel when he's just Daniel. When he is an indeterminate unity, that's when he is determinate, most determinately himself from an external position. When we cannot quantify Daniel as anything other than Daniel, as a self-same unity, that's when he is Daniel to the world, right? And so again, interiors and exteriors, when things are interior, their interiority has reached indeterminacy, that is when they are externally or objectively determinate. And that is the thing that I think is always getting sort of lost when people are looking at Hegel and thinking about, indeterminacy. And we're always, and also the move Zizek makes is very similar to the moves he makes fun of in Buddhism, where he's trying to sort of essentially almost remove himself from committing to anything. by saying, well, we always have this split. We're always both. We're always should, and why? Why would we want to always be both? Well, so that we don't make fools of ourselves. Why don't we want to make fools of ourselves? Well, it's painful to make a fool of yourself. It's painful to fall fully in love and then have your heart broken. So instead, we'll know that fully falling in love is impossible, and it's always an illusion. These are always suspect moves. Whenever we preemptively attempt to precondition our commitments such that we cannot fall fully into them, you should always question the motivations behind those philosophies, because at the end of the day, what we want to experience is ourselves, and the only way to experience ourselves is to experience the indeterminacies of the subjective state, the full subjectivity, and then experience the dissolution of it and fully engage with the pain of it, and so on and so forth. So much of the Hegelian self-helpy sort of like literature out there is about how to avoid falling into the trap of experiencing pain from a full commitment to something. Oh no, it's this and that. Well, fucking commit. Go ahead and commit, because the only way you'll actually your knowledge base will progress, and the only way we actually progress anyway in knowledge acquisition is to fully make something second nature and then let it be confronted with a prediction error which disrupts or ruptures the very indeterminacy of unity that we thought. Wait, I thought this was a pen. Wait, you mean I can also write with this ointment? That could be a pen? Whoa, and now my indeterminate second nature of like what is a pen gets ruptured. But good, and that's how we grow, is these sort of stacks of pain. But to be like, well, I'm not going to fully commit that this is a pen because it could not be a pen, to have that as your sort of predetermined outlook upon life is already suspect, because basically what you're trying to do is avoid pain while living, and thereby not really committing to the phenomenological gift that is subjectivity.
To Mr. Luber here. So there's a few things. As you all know, I'm obsessed with the phenomenology of the artist, because I think this problem that is being pointed out basically can only be approached, and I think you're pointing to it, Mr. Ebert, by thinking of a certain phenomenology. And for me, the phenomenology of the artist is particularly useful. The act of writing a story, not being an artist, but the act of the creative act, which is very interesting of that, because you're doing something so dynamic, but then you get to this point where you're so saturated in it that there's a kind of, you're very determinate in the act of writing. Everyone else could see you, but you've actually reached a certain self-saturation. Now, what I would ask at that point is, could we say, because I think on this notion of this passing over into otherness, like he stresses in the remarks of the science of logic, where when you talk about it, things pass over into otherness, you have to work really hard to get to the place where you're actually able to engage in writing or music making to the point where then you can actually be in that indeterminacy saturated to where you become determinate, and the indeterminacy is from the outside observer onto you, right? Like, is that a fair thing to say, that the indeterminacy kind of moves to the outside in a way, Mr. Ebert? What would you say to that?
Are you referring to like an artist is in their state and they're absorbed and then they're producing
like the Michael Jordan example that you made?
Such a magnificent performance that you get lost and you temporarily sort of are in co-resonance, and there's isomorphic indeterminacy occurring. I mean, that's the ideal, right? Is to lift as an artist or as a performer, or even when we get into these conversations, sometimes they suddenly momentarily feel sublime and lifted up, and I think that, you know, I mean, we could speculate as to why witnessing someone else's indeterminate interiority might trigger an indeterminate state for ourselves. But usually the reason is, or from a sort of predictive mind theoretical standpoint, the reason is that it's so rare that you're actually witnessing a prediction error, because you're so used to everyone talking just like this and being self-aware and awkward and whatever, then when you suddenly see someone fully immersed and fully captivated by themselves and fully in a self-attracted state of movement and equilibrium, and non-dynamic interiority, which on the exterior is hyperdynamic. When you experience something that's hyperdynamic, it produces a prediction error, which itself triggers either awe triggers awe or an overwhelm of the schematic, the schema, which produces either a sensation of awesomeness or awfulness. And that awesomeness itself, as like Jonathan Haidt and Keltner have done research on, produces the state of awe, which we associate with God or whatever else. So someone else being or rupturing the general schema of dynamic ontology, this ontological schema, simply rupturing it does. And this is what Zizek, notes, and I think it's correct, which is that when we have those ontological ruptures, which are produced vis-a-vis the very limitations of phenomenological schema, right? They're in excess of our present schema, so there's the limit, right? And we experience an indeterminacy because it is in excess, it's within the phenomenological gaps. We can experience then our own indeterminate state, so long as we feel safe and so on, we'll experience it as a kind of blissful indeterminacy. And one of the great features of that is that one indeterminacy is literally mathematically isomorphic to any other indeterminacy. They're effectively both infinities. And so you're suddenly in a full-blown schematic, intellectual, cognitive, ontologic, or phenomenological resonance with whomever you're witnessing. And so all of us, and then if the whole crowd is, then everyone is in literally isomorphic resonance. Some people like a morphic field with everyone else. And even though qualitatively we might be having idiosyncratic experiences, quantitatively they're all suddenly put into equivalency, and so we're all resonant in a very energetically factual way. It's pretty interesting.
I think so. That was key. So there's a kind of spreading when everyone is watching Michael Jordan and he's in this kind of supreme kind of saturation, if you will, of flow. It actually kind of spreads, right? There's almost a communal effect that you could say. There's a relational effect. I would associate that, just as a little note, with the gathering of beauty. Like when that beauty, there's a beautiful thing. It kind of gathers everyone under it, and that there's a kind of belonging in that. That there's a kind of yes that is there, that has a certain saturation. So here's another quick question. Do you think, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Luber. Do you think that experience is on the same, dare I say, gradient as the experience of the spaghetti, or what you're talking about in your relationship? Do you think they are on the same, not maybe of the same intensity, but maybe they're on the same gradient, the same structure? Do they have something to do with one another? We think. Now, that's an open question because, and one of the reasons I ask it is because I actually, funny enough, from my own personal experience that I cannot substantiate at any point whatsoever, but I'll say it anyway, my experience is the likelihood of people who are able to find this kind of satisfaction in the relationship or not needing ambition, you're more working through attraction, tend to be creatives who have actually proven capable of reaching those sort of flow states that they might be able to do on a stage or to do with other people in improvisation. There is something about those sorts of people that, in my experience, have the higher probability of operating in this kind of preserved space that Wim was talking about, or you're talking about your own relationship, that is like the person who is just born in the country and never goes off, but is qualitatively different because they've actually gone through a certain process. Do you think there's some, like we were saying earlier, do we think there's some sort of relation between those things? Mr. Ebert.
It's interesting how there are certain repeatable experiences that are always, and this is fascinating, and I don't think anyone's ever figured this out. Why are certain repeatable experiences always in excess of the ontological schema? Why do they always produce the indeterminacy associated with awe or schematic excess? Why is it that we cannot simply say, oh, there's the Grand Canyon, or Grand Canyon's a bad example. It's overused and it may not produce awe in some people, but in that moment where you are eye to eyeball with your lover, and everything is just, and all of a sudden there's a isomorphic resonance, and you experience this prediction error, which never fails to feel like a roller coaster of perfection. Why is it that we cannot simply experience it, assimilate it, oh, that's this, and then from there on, never have our schema accessed in that department again? Why is it that it is not simply, oh, there's the marker. This isn't any longer like, whoa, red? And it makes, like, why can I constantly experience surprise with certain states? And whether or not I might experience that with the making of the spaghetti, you know, if I always experience it, the making of the spaghetti, as part of the training process, or the practice room, which will eventually, once we start jazzing and jamming late night, one of these nights, I don't know when the performance is, oh, it's now, we're in bed, oh, here we go, we're riffing, oh, let me get ready for this, and now I'm in the zone. I recognize the spaghetti making and the this and the painting of the fucking trim on the baseboards, which I hate doing, and then the catching of the fucking bug, because the girls in the house are always, they can't get used to bugs. That's always in excess of their schema, and I always have to catch them annoyingly and like throw them outside. I recognize all of these things as the practicing of the instrument, which eventually leads to the performance, which is sublime. And so, you know, whether or not we witness Michael Jordan in his practice and hanging out with kids when he's teaching them, and I've seen a lot of videos of Michael Jordan practicing, and I don't get that sensation of like, oh my God. But neither does he, right? He's just doing the drills and so on, and we do these things. And this is what I was saying, is like my life feels like the project now. My relationships feel like the project. And whether or not that is by virtue of me having abandoned that, or been so, maybe not astray, but so so neurotically focused on my project-oriented ambitions in the world, and now I can come back to this with a new sort of like aha and wonder. I'll never know the answer to that, you know, and I seem to feel like I see people, you know, whether or not they can be politically captured and so on. Yeah, maybe they can be. I don't know. Anyway, long way of saying that the spaghetti, then we get to the drunker monk problem again, which at some point I have to just write about. But the making of the spaghetti, let's say the making of the spaghetti has undergone such its own dialectic of repetition that it has sublated properly into the indeterminacy of second nature, automaticity, non-dynamical anymore. You're just making the spaghetti because that's what the mama taught you, and it's in your blood, and you cannot not make it perfectly because you always make it perfectly because you just know how to make it. So it's no longer a dynamical interaction, it's a non-dynamical automaticity, second nature, which is itself sublated and is its own beauty, right? Because it is just simply this thing that is an extension of your being. Now, does that produce for you the Michael Jordan moment of awe? No, ironically, because it is indeterminate, it is precisely a determinate feature of your life. It's just something that you do, that you don't think about. It's these moments that present themselves as indeterminate, exceeding your ability to schematize them, that produce this sensation of awe or indeterminacy because they are precisely in excess or beyond the limit, within the gaps, the phenomenological gaps, however you want to describe this sensation of indeterminacy, which we can get. And the question as to whether or not that sense of, I think this is the question, this is what I want to know. So this is how I'm going to interpret your question. Sorry, I'm rambling on. It's tough to think through, but is the state of self-okayness, or like, self-relating infinity, the sublated state of like this is perfect, this is being, is the state of like I am in my indeterminate interiority of subjectivity, and I am not defending it and thereby objectifying and alienating myself, but living within the spirit of self. Is that isomorphic to the more ecstatic state of awe that we might get with a prediction error, like a Michael Jordan being hyperdynamical in his state? I don't know how to answer that except to momentarily just meditate. Yeah, I don't know how. It's not qualitatively the same, and I'm not even, and I don't know that it's quantitatively the same, and this still has to be worked out in my view. And of course, the negative side and the reason we ask these questions are like, well, what about the fundamentalist? They seem to be in a state of self-relating sort of self-sameness. What differentiates that from the sort of bliss point and these sort of questions? Again, what I would say though with the fundamentalist, because I think I'm starting to answer that question, is that the fundamentalist is in the state of self-preservation, which is self-objectifying, self-alienating, and thereby not really living within the indeterminacy, indeterminate interiority of the subjective viewpoint, and rather viewing themselves from a self-alienated position. That's what I want to say about that. But anyway, sorry for hogging time.
No, that was outstanding. So this is my own thoughts, and I'll give it Mr. Luber. So there's something very interesting. So if I were to say, you were describing, you get the stage ready, or you're doing the instruments to be ready for the thing, you know, the performance, the flow that comes forth, where there's a certain, what all you can do in a weird way is prepare, right? Like ready, right? If I were to defend, because the way I think about the incomplete, on the notion of the subject is incomplete, is that you cannot snap your fingers and make beauty show up. You cannot snap your fingers and enter flow. That is outside the internal consistency of your subjectivity. Like, you can't do it. It's always beyond you. But here's the weird thing. You can so come to terms with that, and so come to terms with all you can do is make yourself ready to receive it, that you actually find a kind of completeness in just readiness. This is, I think, the weird move. Now, if I'm sympathetic, because I do have sympathies toward the emphasis on the impossibility, the emphasis on the impossibility of completeness, because how I interpret that in some of the kind of Marxist thought is the notion of capitalism promises you that once you climb a certain ladder, once you follow a certain social contract, you will be satisfied. And a lot of them are saying it's a trap. And in fact, the problem is, by the time you find out it's a trap, you may have lost the opportunity to go back, right? Like, you may have lost 30 years. And by emphasizing climbing a ladder, then you actually did not do the work of getting ready. So now you've missed the opportunity to get ready for a thing that might come forth, right? And so there's a way where, Mr. Tyler, good to see you, where when we talk about the impossibility of completion, what we mean by that is that you will never be able to climb a ladder or follow a social contract to a place where you find completion. But that doesn't mean there isn't the possibility of a certain completion that is found in this actually kind of state of readiness. And in fact, actually, I definitely would say from my own personal experience, there are a lot of people who actually still believe in the social contract, or believe that if they do X, Y, and Z, they will find completeness, and thus are not doing the work on themselves to be capable of the kind of readiness or the waiting for beauty to come forth. And I think this does get into the notion of virtue, Jockin, the beauty, goodness as this thing that is outside your scope, that can break through if you're ready for it, right? But since a lot of people instead emphasize climbing a ladder or finding what they've always wanted, or doing the social contract to get a house and so on and so forth, they then are not spending their time to spend their time in a way where they are actually able as a subject to have that kind of readiness, so that that they can find a kind of completion is, because it's almost like there's the possibility of a completeness in an art, in a kind of, but that is ultimately resolved to, or resolute to, like Hegel's is resolution to, only being capable of a readiness, and you must fight to preserve this place of readiness, and there's no guarantee of the event, the beauty, the goodness coming forth. But there actually is a kind of goodness in even just the mere readiness. Just the mere readiness, or the being able to receive the beauty or the flow, et cetera, so forth, coming forth in of itself leads to a certain completeness. Because what you're doing, to go back to our distinction between attraction and ambition, is you are making yourself ready for the kind of person that it can experience something that attracts you. But this is the key. The difference there is it's encounter-based, just like freak theory, right? What you're doing is living your life in such a way where you actually find completeness in being resolute with the readiness for encounter. And in fact, you look forward to the encounter, the thing coming forth, and you are going to fight to preserve it and to maintain it. And there is some sort of belonging in that. And that is what, for me, is the belonging again. And then the question is scaling that, spreading that. Can you? What does that look like in the classroom? How do you teach people? What does that look like in politics, economics? And if we cannot do this, then there is no alternative value form beyond capital, which means we cannot move from stimulating demand to creating demand, which means that you're going to end in all these multipolar traps that we are describing. But that sort of coming to terms with readiness, because I guess that's how I think about it. Like you know that you can't snap your fingers and make the flow appear. You can't snap your fingers and make beauty appear. But you also are at home in that. You're at home in the just work of the readiness, the telling of the story, or just doing the spaghetti, or doing the garden, or doing the things that you've absolutely chosen to do because they attract you, not out of some sort of desiring status, but because there's a shine that attracts you, that absolute choice. And there's a kind of incompleteness in the sense that it is not consistent in your internal consistency to snap your fingers and enter a flow state whenever you want, to make beauty come forth whenever you want. But it is in your power to work to constantly make yourself in the place to be ready for that thing outside of your control. And then you resolve yourself to that. And that's the kind of open future, I think. And I think that's what we can do. And that creates a very different kind of subject who is working to create a life versus wait for things to stimulate them into life. And if we continue to have a system that is reliant on stimulation, I think there are pathologies from that. That is the way I think about it. I think it is painting a picture of a possibility of belonging again that is actually at home in that, in the kind of structure of motivation I think you've been pointing to, Mr. Ebert, and I appreciate it. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, please. And Tyler, good to see you, sir. I hope you are well. Mr. Luber.
I'm definitely jumping late into the conversation, but from what I gather, I really like what is being said. A couple notes that I noticed. One, and I've thought a lot about this, like in my book, I talk about basketball a lot. So like this Michael Jordan example, in my mind, like, and Ebert, like, tell me in your own experience, like, if I'm wrong for saying this, but basically, when you kill it, you kind of know that you're killing it. I don't think he's like, I think when Michael Jordan, like, fucks somebody up on the court, he knows exactly that he just fucked someone up on the court. I don't think there's this, like, flow state where he's unaware of that completely. At some point, even if it's after, he's aware that he just hit a game-winning shot. He's aware of the all that he created. So in my mind, like the all and awful, it's very easy to think about in terms of a story where basically the inciting incident is either all or awful, and the climax is either all or awful, juxtaposing whatever the all or awful was earlier. So typically if it's like, I'm just being crude, if it's awful in the beginning, you get the awesome at the end, and then you flip it. Or it's inverted. That's typically what happens. The second act, you're so not in the flow state. You're recalibrating yourself based off of how you were just dislodged, either via elevation of awesomeness or like being devalued in a certain sense by awfulness. So in my mind, when we're watching a game we're not actually watching the second act of the story. We're either watching the exposition or literally the resolution. The game, if you want to talk about it from like for me, what's appropriate phenomenologically, the game of basketball, we're only seeing either the beginning or the end of the story when we're watching the game. The second act is typically the work that goes into even having an exposition in the first place, or even seeing the resolution at the end. So like right now, the NBA finals are on right now. To me, we're watching the resolution. Like the entire story, if you will, that we've been watching nowadays is like the resolution. It's not something that is, and maybe I'm getting it mixed up. Because you talk very fast, and I'm very attracted to the way you say indeterminate, saturation, all those words. But it's easy for me to mix up. To me, there's something very determinable about the resolution. Like the indeterminacy is typically in the second act. You don't really know how you're going to go into the game. But like once you're in the game, you're in it, and everything is extremely determinable, including your own like phenomenological intake of playing the game. So I wonder, well, before I keep going, I just want to clarify, when we're watching Michael Jordan, are you saying we're watching him being from an interiority, he's determined, and therefore from an exteriority, like from us watching Michael Jordan, almost anything is liable to happen because he's in such a consistent state internally? Is that what you're saying?
Well, okay, so you just mentioned me talking fast, right?
Yeah.
So this is actually a good example. So in order for me to be able to talk fast about indeterminacy and interiority and exteriority, I have to have spent a bunch of time thinking about what those things mean and thinking about them so much that they get integrated in sort of a second nature way, so that I'm no longer thinking about what they mean, right? They are sort of, again, to bring up this Hegelian thing, I've repeated the dialectic of their meanings to such an extent that they've exceeded a quantitative threshold in my brain, after which they have graduated into both an interior indeterminacy and an exterior determinacy, such that I no longer question that the candle is a candle. I've already gone through the process of wondering what the candle is exactly. And then finally, the candle is simply the candle, right? And at that point, like I mentioned, Daniel is simply Daniel. What's important about knowing when something becomes only what it is, when the basketball is just a basketball, what occurs is it is now, it's occupying a state of potentiality because it is unified. And when something is unified, it evades description. What is it? It's a basketball. No, what is it? A basketball. Because I've already figured out that it's a ball and it bounces like this and like that. And if I do this and I do that, I no longer think about that anymore. From now on, it's simply an extension of my being. And that's the state at which it occupies both the indeterminacy in its unity. And so as a unified object, it is determinate, but it's only determinate and unified because it has a unification which is defying description because it is unified. So it's both, right? When Michael Jordan is playing and he is in the middle of the thing, no, I don't think he's thinking I'm crushing it. In fact, whenever I've been on stage and I'm like, this happens all the time. I'm doing a thing, and all of a sudden I notice that I'm amazing. I'm like, oh my God, I'm singing this amazingly, or I'm performing, I'm out of control. This is incredible. This must be. And as soon as that thought takes over, then I'm watching myself. I'm no longer in it. And I can ride that wave for a little while, but then all of a sudden I'm out of it. And what do I have to do to get back? I have to get to that state of readiness and wait for the next wave. And actually, I disagree with Daniel. I can get ready right away. But it takes practice, and it's what my mother teaches actually, like actor studios, relaxation. How quickly can you relax yourself to allow yourself to become how quickly can you prepare the vessel to allow the thing to flow through again? And I'm sure that Jordan goes through the same thing. It's like he just scores. Okay, now he's out of it for a moment. Going to run back on the other side of the court. Okay, get ready, and now I'm into it again. And I think that oscillation is occurring at all times. But anyway, I know that it's sort of weird to describe the indeterminacy, but I think that I love coming to this idea of like Daniel. And you can say any object is the object. What's the object? It's like the who's on first thing. And that's the point at which the thing you're describing, the object, occupies a state of descriptive indeterminacy. And that very descriptive indeterminacy is what unifies the object as a determinate object that you no longer have to think about. I wish I was able to describe it in an easier fashion, but it's one of these double-sided, complexities that's very difficult to summarize otherwise.
I think, not to speak for Daniel, like the discrepancy between that immediate moment, you can make an equivalence. That immediate moment, so to speak, is also the surprise. You can't have, there's only typically in a story, there's one surprise typically. You can't have a bunch of surprises, and you can't really control when that surprise happens. But to get on the path in which that surprise occurs, I agree, you can start like that. You can immediately start the path. But like, what you thought was that immediate surprise in the beginning, to me, is just like the immediate awareness that you're on your way to something beautiful occurring. Which there has to be part of that surprise that's to come, that's packaged in that initial awareness that you're on the path. So I think it's very easy to conflate basically that initial, that, because there is that, because I know what you mean. Like, someone could just tell me, come up with an idea and write a story, and it's like, boom, I did it. But like the real, like, still hasn't quite happened yet. I still have to keep going. I still have to keep writing the story. In fact, most cases, it's beyond just writing the story. I have to even storyboard is typically when that, in my mind, happens. But yeah, I'm curious what you have to say to that. But real quick, other things that were talked about that piqued my interest was basically like the order of philosophy seemed to come up here, where it's like, oh, I have a certain ontology, and in that sense, I'm like, when Zizek and Tupanchitz are able to point out, oh, and this is when being acts weird, and boom, now I have an ontology of difference. To me, when you have an ontology, that means you already have a prescribed story, a prescribed worldview, a way at looking at. Sorry, I'm making lunch at the same time. I'm pulling a Michelle, or I'm trying to right now. You already have a worldview that's established. I think instead of trying to judge and point out an ontology as being essentially like the first principle of philosophy, I'm kind of leaning toward like a Levinas way of looking at it, just because I'm like reading him right now. I'm probably a little biased, but it definitely makes sense for me when and I keep referring to writing a story, and I'm sorry, but there's a question, which is, how do we go about this? Like, I'm talking with other people, and it's almost like there's a certain ethics actually that comes first, where it's like, this can be anything. So what should we do? It's not necessarily what do I notice or what do I find relevant. There seems to be first like a depossession. It's like, let's point out how we're so not possessed by any one idea. And then in figuring out basically how we both can be possessed by something, then ontology starts to take shape. We're able to see an ontology that comes forth. Another thing that clicked for me was like the beauty theme distinction, because there is something other that I have to deal with first before I'm commanded to do it. And like ontology appears when there's a command to do it. There's no ontology before that. Like you can't really ontologize. That's why like Levinas like almost wanted to have like a different philosophical inquiry that's not quite like ontology, that's almost like pre-ontology, that he calls ethics. But the way he kind of goes about it, it sort of seems like ontology, but it's not ontology because it's at a different time in the unfolding of philosophizing. Like it's just it's recognized, and like I feel like Jockin said it best to me. We don't understand why we don't understand why we understand what we understand. Like we really don't have a grip on our own understanding, and like we have to come to some form of grip, some form of like short circuit first, and that's when ontology then appears. So I am curious, like people's thoughts on that. And like with that said, like again, that the surprise only happens to me when ontology becomes realizable. But when you're in the domain of ethics that is happening before ontology, there is a certain sense of a surprise that gets you on the path for an ontology to be realized, but it's not the same surprise. I want to say it's an attraction. There's an initial attraction that first occurs, which then gives you the possibility of the surprise. So like to me, when you turn it on, what you're turning on is like, yeah, I'm hot. This is attractive. And like there's like, it's not pushing the boundary conditions, the horizon of understanding in any way. It's making us first be aware of the horizon. That's what the attraction's doing. The surprise is reorienting how we even see the horizon in the first place, which is like a totally different mode. And I think like entertainment makers, people that tell stories, write music, play sports, blah, write whatever, like they're in the business of attraction. And if you're good at it, then you might lead to a surprise. And the surprise aspect is very subjective. That's the hard part too. Like Michael Jordan, people might not be surprised by Michael Jordan. Like if you're a basketball lover, it's pretty hard not to be surprised if you're watching it in real time and you've never seen it before in the 90s. I'm sure it was incredible. I'm a bit too young, so I wouldn't know. But there is definitely an initial attraction that's like unescapable. Like when you're good at something, that comes with it. But like the surprise element has to do with the subject who's experiencing it and their historicity toward what they're experiencing. And like if they don't have a certain like pattern in their historicity that calls for like almost like a recipe calls for the surprise to happen, then it just won't happen. And that's okay. And that doesn't mean it's like bad or not good per se. It just means that it didn't mesh in the most ideal way. And then last thing, what you guys were talking about is making me think about my short, because, and I've made changes, Daniel, since you've read it, but I really brought out basically in my short, I use this fourth wall as a way to show like an excess of interior and a certain excess of an interior consistency. And like once that occurs, his identity actually ironically starts to break down. He like can't actually become himself because the internal consistency that brought him to that point of identity isn't actually being matched anymore. It's the world is rejecting that internal consistency that brought him to the place of him being able to call himself whatever he is. So I think there's a funny thing where typically what happens when you have a certain internal consistency at that moment is almost the beginning of your death. There's something very static in that. And like, I would imagine that, like when Michael Jordan pivoted and he went and played baseball, before that, there was like a certain internal consistency where he's like, I am that guy, and therefore I can leave. Like there was a certain depth in realizing that he is that guy. Like the second you're like, I am that guy, is the second you are probably no longer that guy anymore. And that's sad. That is sad, because I do think people strive to become that guy in their own ideal way. And I wonder how you can, and this is a question I'll leave to the table. I know I've been talking for a while. I wonder, how do you have this readiness, this waitingness? You have, like, that is a necessary thing, but at the same time, you trying to be that guy, like, they don't seem compatible, because the second you're trying to be that guy, it seems like you're not really becoming like ready to actually be yourself, because the self is beyond that guy that you have in mind, but yet you can't escape the effort in trying to be that guy. You know, like, I write stories, I'm trying to be something, you know, like even us participating in this, like we're participating in something to achieve some type of finite static thing. And then what? Do we just stop participating in it? I don't know. It's a very different discourse. It's a very different way of going about it than if you were to go about your life saying, like, how do I make this story? How do I make myself? And that seems very loose and very flimsy and not very like tangible for me to like actually do tangible behaviors for. It seems like I would be in a constant state of exposition if I were to go about that. But it does seem like there is something about having that position of like, how do we actually like create? And I mean that in like the crude sense of like, how do we create the net? Like the Daniel and Michelle conversation. I like to think about that, because I feel like there's very loose parameters that are here, but yet they had to be thought through. And like, I don't know, I just find that interesting. I hope I made sense. I'll pass it off.
It made a lot of sense, and I'll give it to Mr. Wynn. And then, alas, I will have to go at about 15 or so minutes for some obligations. But you said that was a lot. So I certainly do not disagree that you can be ready on the snap of a finger. In fact, that capacity to be ready on the snap of the finger, I would argue, is a necessary component of the possibility of belonging again. That being ready, the question, so there's a few things. In my opinion, it seems as if that capacity to be ready on the spot that Mr. Ebert was describing requires a lot of work. It is not something that one naturally has, say, if they're born and they're content with life. The problem is, because they don't have the ability to be ready on the spot, if somebody comes in, a strong man to manipulate them, somebody threatens them with otherness, they're not able to be ready for it on the spot, so they get manipulated, right? But then the other side of it is, rather than be ready on the spot, you could just not commit to anything, right? Because then you never have to be ready for anything, because you don't have any stakes anywhere, right? So there's something about the capacity to be ready on the spot that seems really tied to the capacity to belong again and to self-defend a space in which something could come forth. What I meant earlier when I said that I wonder if the spaghetti and Michael Jordan are on the same gradient is if precisely the experience of some sort of beauty, some sort of flow, something coming forth is precisely why you do the work to be ready on the spot, which then translated into your capacity to be ready on the spot to experience spaghetti as satisfying and beautiful and not needing to strive. To be ready on the spot to actually experience sitting on the porch is all you need for the evening, not needing to go. There's something about that being ready on the spot and then having actually almost a new baseline of readiness to receive life that seems to be a product to some degree of at least knowing the possibility of a beauty, a flow, of something, an indeterminacy that is mixed with the determinacy coming forth, that then you do the work because you have been attracted to the vision of that experience, of which then attracts you to do the work so that you can be ready on the spot. That seems different from having an ambition to be ready, which I think speaks to Mr. Luber's point. So this is the weird thing. It does not seem to me as if ambition that is completely devoid of some sort of experience of something beyond you that almost saturates you that being readiness tends to then get co-opted into various power dynamics. So the question that I think Mr. Luber is asking is, how does one keep the be readiness to a place where it is about receiving, therefore like receiving the beauty or receiving the flow, as opposed to becoming something that's just more of, like you're saying, an exposition or problematic, right? Well, this is where I think this classical notion of beauty is outside of you, that what you want to do is always be ready to receive it, and yet it is outside of you, is such a big deal, because it has to feel like your command is outside of you. Because if it's not outside of you, then you're speaking it to yourself, which puts it into the realm of the expositional, and it's not a story, right? But that means waiting is a key posture for all of this. And basically also what we are describing is that the socioeconomic order cannot move out of its current game theory dynamics unless the average subjectivity is somehow aligned with what we are describing. That seems to be aligned with the phenomenology of the artist, the story, etc., so forth. It has something to do with the capacity to wait. But in that waiting, you also have this capacity where you're ready for the thing to break through. And what's interesting is that waiting is incomplete in the sense that it is open to the thing breaking through, that is the encounter, that you can, although you can be ready for the encounter at any moment, once you get to a certain level of work, you can't make the encounter occur, because if you make it occur, it's not an encounter, it's not a surprise. You willed it. A surprise has to be surprising. A surprising has to be an encounter. It cannot be something you summon, and yet you can be ready for the thing that comes forth, right? And so you have to work really, 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 really hard to be capable of at any point being ready for something coming forth that you cannot summon. But that is necessarily what must be the structure for story and theme in the way that Mr. Luber describing, which I do think gets back to the relation of virtue and beauty that Mr. Jockin is teaching on, that we see in Plato, that I think also is the letting, because you're working really hard to get to the place where you can let being be come forth as itself. You're able to let it be on the fly with a certain, dare I say, faith or absolute choice that being is the kind of thing that from that posture can encounter you, come forth, and then in that encounter, you're attracted to it. There's the command. You must change your life. You must write belonging again. Why? You must go back into the cave. You're forced back in, right? That dynamic seems to be, this entire schema seems to be necessary, basically, for the possibility of people who are more virtue and attraction-based to enter into positions of like the White House or authority or CEOs. Because we were saying earlier, I'm sympathetic to Plato forcing the philosopher king back into the cave, because they're satisfied and would never do it. And Friedrich Hayek warns that the reason why the worst get to the top is because power tends to attract the worst kind of people. So then you get all the multipolar traps. The argument has to be expanded upon that. So how do you get the best people in those positions where there needs to be some kind of force, some sort of external thing that forces them in? But what's the difference between dragging and becoming that we've talked about with belonging again? There seems to be a massive difference between having the kind of posture where something can come forth and attract you, which requires a certain readiness so that you're able to experience it and to encounter and work from there. So that is, and then it does seem that there is some kind of completeness, or the term I use is harmony, with that kind of schema. And it's almost like you want to talk open completeness versus complete or incomplete. There's a sublation of a kind of open completeness. You are complete in being open to the thing coming forth, which means you're open, so you're never closed. So there's a kind of incompleteness, but it's open completeness, almost with a hyphen there. And you actually find completeness in that openness, which again, going back to Plato, is precisely the gathering. You're complete in being gathered under beauty, which then, to the point of the Daniel, the particular thing, every single particular phenomenon is an excess in its particularity, its definitiveness versus a definition. Daniel is an excess. You have to know Daniel. I can know what a man is, the definition, as Jockin and I have spoken about. But for the definitiveness, the shining force, you have to get to the particularity. Another way to think about open completeness in this way is that you actually are aware of that fact. That you're open to particular divinative things that you always have to let shine forth, never close off, because there's always an excess shining forth that you're ready to encounter whatever shines forth from that thing. So another way to put this is the moment you complete to something, the moment you commit to something deeply, then it is going to move from a definition to a definitive. The moment you commit to something, it's going to move from the definitional to the definitive. The moment it moves into the definitive and you are committed to it, no worries, Mr. Luber, then it moves into being a definite excess. Therefore, it has the possibility of shine, therefore the possibility of beauty, and the way that Plato and Jockin talk about, which then requires you to be ever open to it, and you are, in fact, ready for whatever comes forth in that opening, because you've done the work and you can be ready on the fly. You can be ready on the fly. And thus, there's a harmony in that you come to terms with. And then the question is, what would it mean to spread that? But let me give it to Mr. Wynn here. Mr. Wynn, please.
It's funny how this works. Like I wrote, like just before you started speaking, I wrote open to the open. And like the second word you said was about open. It's good. That's nice when things become cyclical and it all makes absolute sense. I think I made the point with Luber when he said about this thing with ontology. Like, I think I'll just approach what I put towards the end, which was meant to be for Luber. Then it's Luber and Daniel. Open to the open, open completeness. That's a very nice way to word this. To the thing coming forth. I think what's nice about this is like my comportment of being open comes from, and this is what was said about beauty, like I have this surprise event of beauty and I walk away from that event of beauty and I register, God, that was nice. I didn't achieve much in the event, but now that I've gone back into the everydayness of what seems to be quite hard, the job, the like I think there's an awareness of a knowing concerning this. And this is what the question is, like, how do we achieve the reinvigoration of the spontaneity of surprise? Like, how do we get home in that sense, like how do we go home to that event? I think this is what then connects to what Luber asked, like, how is it then with knowledge as like the finite static image? That was a nice way to put it in some sense. How do we, and this like, I think goes to Andrew's interest, like with theme, like theme seems to be like a collection of static images that we put together to create stories or not, and I think this thing would go to what Javier said about pragmatism, just to connect this. And I made this note saying finite, static, and it kind of sounds like Alan Watts would talk like this in a way. I think this came up in the conversation with Javier on like negative pragmatism, where I introduced just a comment on Alan Watts because he is a pragmatist in that sense. Indeterminacy is his philosophy, but he would say the finite static images can bring you to that experience. And I said finite static image can be aimed for, but with the knowing that what is actual or what is surprising is a movement which moves of itself. So this, in this sense, the static image never is really static, because through a particular good, through a particular theme, you can be surprised. And so what you're doing is you're carrying that knowledge that in some way, in any theme, in the spaghetti, in the candle, there is always room for surprise. But then you could maybe be pragmatic to actualize those ways of being, which are more likely to be surprising, in some sense. And I said this, that in this sense, and it's like Watt's language about the ego image, like the ego is that which we associate ourselves with, subject, object, image concerning ourselves, and it dries everything up in life. How do we escape the ego? For him, you escape the ego when you recognize that the image itself of the ego that you have of yourself is itself an image, and that can never determine the surprise. But in knowing this, you're opened to the open at that precise point. The ego image is in its precise sense that which can be gathered in a way other than that on relying on the completion of an image. Knowing can gather the net together, like this conversation, and be compelled towards it based upon a remembering, not a recalling, of the type of quality of the conversation, which in my opinion opens us up to the open. I can use my memory, I can recall this event of last Thursday, and I can say, well, like this morning, okay, like that would be nice to do, because like I know that in this conversation, I'm kind of opened up in some sense. Because even if we repeat a lot of this, like the last 4 weeks for me have been like a very beautiful repetition. In this experience, I find myself writing notes and everything, and I'm like, oh, And this comes to the question Andrew said, like, what happens if you reflect upon this conversation right now? It's like, yeah, damn, this is nice. But then perhaps that jolts, like this is what Alex said about being on stage. But then how do we get back into the flow in a way? Like, I think it is kind of easy when I listen and I wait, you know, and I catch things and I see things that just happen to appear from other people's ideas and words. And I think that's a nice way to then introduce the letting. Like, I see that each of you have a perspective which is provoking me, and I'm not having to do that. I'm literally not doing anything. I'm just listening or waiting in that sense. And one final point, I know that you said you have to go, about this ontology, very, very quickly. What's interesting about Zizek's ontology and Sapunch's, and the reason why I think there is an element of truth in their philosophies, and an affirmative truth, is that their philosophies incorporate and structure themselves upon a gap in ontology itself. So when their ontologies fail to meet the mark or be completed in and of themselves, they fail. And in the experience of the failure, they say, haha, see, even our ontologies fail. And that says something about the being that our ontologies are trying to get to. I said, unless the worldview, because you mentioned about worldview, unless the worldview looks to the gap and fails as an ontology, and so finds its truth in the failure itself. This is why failure seems to be the ontological status of being for them. However, another alternative, and then I'm going to stop talking. Worldview or ontology or phenomenology of letting, which fails to hold itself as a theme, and so fails, but in failing, it realizes that things are let be already, and that even the desire to ontologize being is let be. But it is precisely here that ontology finds itself at home as phenomenology. This is why ontology comes after the experience of beauty or being, but finds itself as originary in the failure to even achieve itself. Actually, Heidegger makes a comment that even the name of being at this point can be given up. We let being be whatever it comes to be, and we see how it comes forth as the letting which lets us let it be, whatever it comes to be. And again, there's a repetition of failure or a repetition of the event in some sense. And this is the problem with Zizek, is he quickly ontologizes that repetition of the event and says, aha, being is cracked, it's inconsistent, it's negative. And that's my, yeah.
No, outstanding. And I'm so sorry to have to go with various obligations. What you were saying about that quality of remembering, and there's a certain quality of experience that gathers, that is getting at, indeed, what is required for community that is more synthome, as Cadell puts it, versus hypostasis, or kind of the neurotic or authority-based, this kind of memory of, oh, let me enter that place of surprise, that place of encounter. Don't know what we're going to talk about, but you're going to be kind of ready. You know, you're going to be ready for that kind of thing, right? And I think also, so what is the ultimate way? Like, if I were to say, what is the ultimate test for readiness? Because that's what, like, that ability, you know, that question of bringing it back. Just like that, right? That seems to be really important, to be able to actually have a kind of belonging that can't be threatened or taken away, etc. No problem, Mr. Jockin, I do have to run. The ultimate, like, thing, the ultimate surprise is if I say to you, man, this is a good conversation. Oh, we're screwed now. The moment somebody does the recursion move, right? Like the moment somebody says, let's get together to have fun, you're not going to have fun. Like Lewis talks about that, right? The moment you reflect on itself, one could say that one of the ultimate challenges that is needed today in order to actually maintain some sort of harmony or some sort of belonging in the way that we are describing is the capacity to think about yourself or what you are doing and not ruin everything, which is always like the toughest thing ever. But in a way, that's kind of the final test, one of the ways I think about it, because that's like really hard. And if we want to talk about actual anti-fragility or actual community or actually preparedness for every, because in a way to have harmony in any and all circumstances, which even if based on a kind of open incompleteness in the sense of openness, because it's open to the surprise, if that is to actually be maintained, then one of the ultimate possibilities it would have to be able to handle is recursion, the ability to reflect on itself or think in the flow and not use the flow. In a way, we can say that that is the kind of work that one is ready for, that seems distinct from the work of ambition, what you need to do to get the promotion. What do you mean the work you need to do to be able to handle recursion without using your flow? You don't put that on your resume. But the reason you know about that is because you know about a certain possibility of a disclosure of being, a disclosure of something coming forth, and you want to be able to make sure that that coming forth is always possible in all circumstances. So another way to put it, if you want to let being be, then the question is, well, how do you keep letting, right? Well, it's really hard, but you can do it. And maybe the ultimate test is recursion, the reflecting on yourself or thinking about the letting without the letting being lost. Is that even possible? You know, if not, one could argue, I suppose, that there's some sort of point of incompletion, because there's a point that is ultimately overcomable, but I'm not sure. I think that there is a way in which the artist that works and works and works can get to the point where they can actually reflect on what's going on and go right back into the flow, go right back into it and different things like that. But there's something about that test, because the reason why I point out that test is because basically following a Pierce or Reef or whatever, one of the key reasons we lose belonging is because of thinking. You think, what if Christianity is false? What if atheism is false? What if capitalism is not? And once you think that, you destabilize the bottom, you annihilate it, and now you're anxious, right? But that very experience of anxiety is what you must find belonging in, which then, you know, we talk about how now we're in the state of the self-reference. You reflect on yourself in relation to that anxiety to get through yourself as a kind of totality to an open completeness. And then you actually are comfortable in letting that openness be open, because you believe in the possibility of something coming forth, of that you can then have a memory of, that can then forever forth organize your behavior. You come back to the net, you come back to the net, and so on and so forth. And so then when you make your spaghetti, you have a different quality of interaction that is in a way thankful for the opening, thankful for that, and you find a harmony with that because you know spaghetti can come forth to you in a certain way, which you have then worked to be able to be so ready like that because of certain experiences. And Plato would associate that with the beautiful. And then the failure that seems graceful suddenly is the fact that a definition can never be a definitive. Your idea of a man can never be Daniel, woman can never be Michelle, and you become thankful then for a certain definitiveness that can always shine forth in your open completion, that then becomes an attractive function to continue to be motivated because you're motivated toward a Michelle, the source of your beauty, the definitive object. And that, from that kind of schema, that kind of structure, one then finds the intrinsic motivation that is based on the openness to that excessive object, that beauty, that thing that's shining forth. And that intrinsic motivation is, for me, and then I will run, central to the possibility of a sublation of the current socioeconomic system that is based on extrinsic motivation, and thus leads to various pathologies. An intrinsic motivation would open horizons of different possibilities, but note how it is based, like Luber is saying, on something else outside of you shining forth, because if it wasn't, it would be an exposition, not a story. But alas, I will run. Thank you all. I've enjoyed it. This has been wonderful. Ebert, thank you for being here. Wynn, Luber, Tyler, Mr. Jockin, all of you rock. All the best to you. Thank you so much.